Here is Sailor 564. This is a cool, refreshing teal that feels perfect for a warm summer day staring at the ocean on the Gulf Coast of Florida. There is a very slight tone variation as the paper changes, the kind you only see if side by side. It shades well, and the shading is present in every writing sample, which I do love about it. On non-fountain pen friendly paper, it is generally well behaved, as we didn't experience any excessive ghosting. It doesn't feather, and it is so safe on these papers. It's really doing well. As a color, just not my thing. But that doesn't mean that I don't like it or that I wouldn't be happy using a lot of it, though I do need to be in the right mood for this ink.
The pen for today is a Pilot E95S, or Pilot Elite. Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there by looking at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Here we can see that cool, refreshing Gulf Coast ocean blue. Now, there is no feathering and there is no spread. You do see shading going on. Nice, subtle shading in and out of darker and lighter areas. Not huge, but present. It's something that is very nice in its gentle performance. Take a look at right on the third line, where the WR is a little bit lighter than the ITE at the end. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Sailor makes more than one ink, so let's take a look at a few other inks from Sailor.
Here is Sailor Kin Mokusai. Here is Sailor Fuji Musumi. Here is Sailor Gentle Black. Here is Sailor Okuyama.
The second writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter notebook.
Here we can see that the tone is ever so slightly lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Now, it doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade just a little bit less than it does on the Clairfontaine. For the most part, what we're going to get is a nice, solid performing teal color with just the occasional letter that is darker. Now, if you look at integers on the second line, you can see that it's the cross of the T, the E, and the S at the end that are a little bit darker than the rest of the word, but for the most part, we're just going to see words in one tone. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
There's a lot to be learned by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is done the way it's supposed to be done. A line of ink is put down to immediately put into water to show the separation of those colors making the ink. Now the one on the right is marked with a D. This is allowed to dry for 10 minutes before it's put into water. The third writing sample is done in a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the tone, we see that it becomes a little bit more green leaning with this toned paper. What that means is that the tone of the paper is affecting the color that we're seeing with this ink. It means the ink itself is a bit more translucent. Now, it does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just a little bit less than it does on the Clairfontaine. You can easily find words with no shading in it, like proof was on the second line. But created right next to that starts with that nice lighter tone on the CR. The E gets a little bit darker, the A lightens up a little bit, but TED at the end does get a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Resistance tests are done to see how well this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. Now, the smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. In the upper left, you can see where there is highlighter. In the upper right, that is pen flush. The lower left has a 1/3 bleach solution, and the lower right has plain old water. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Here we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, does not spread, does not shade as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, though the shading is still present. Most importantly, taking a look at this quad rule, I don't feel like it stands out against the quad rule strong enough. It does do well that it doesn't get cut by the lines, but just as a tone, the quad rule in what's happening, kind of see them at the same time, which could be a little bit visually confusing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at a few more teal or turquoise inks.
Here is Ferris Wheel Press Bluegrass Velvet Canard Turquoise. Here is Noodler's Ottoman Azure. Here is Robert Oster Turquoise.
Here is Van Diemen's Freyanet Aquamarine.
All of the inks that you just saw have a review here on the channel. Now, the next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
We can see that the tone here is lighter and flatter than it was on the Clairfontaine. Does not feather, does not spread, does have little bits of moments of shading. You can see an integer on the second line where the dot of the I is a bit darker. The TE right in the middle is a little bit darker, and that R at the end is probably the darkest letter of the word. But for the most part, we're seeing a fairly uniform tone through most of this writing. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see inks that are in the same color family, I prefer to find inks that complement the color on the page.
Here is Lamy Mango.
Here is KWZ Iron Gall Violet number 3. Here is Omas Black.
Here is Monteverde Mercury Noir.
The best way you can support this or any channel that you like watching is to alert the retailer of where you saw the product at time of purchase. Now, the last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Here the tone we get is just a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather. It does have the slightest bit of spread, which is not a problem for this paper. It shades still, which is very nice. It does do, I think, well enough that if this is the paper that you're writing on, this is an ink you can use. I think it stands out well, and the performance really looks very nice here, so a good combination. Looking at the back of the page, we only see a few spots that it starts to look a little bit deep into the paper, but it does not over-penetrate really at all. Minimal ghosting. I believe with this ink, if you were writing on both sides, that you could write on both sides of the paper with this ink. Nothing bleeds through touching the other side.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The medium flow, medium nib of the Pilot E95S gives us a cool, refreshing tone with a decent portion of shading through most writing samples. Off camera, I tried this in a dry stub, and the tone lightened a little bit, though not to anywhere near unusable. And the shading was unaffected. I do prefer this slightly darker tone in what we're getting here, though. So I would say go for a medium flow, medium or broad nib to soak up as much of this tone on the paper and enjoy the shading as we can see in the given writing sample.